The psychology of an addict isn't just about substances or behaviors, it's about broken stories, hidden wounds, and silent searches for meaning. This video isn't a judgment, it's an invitation to understand addiction not as a character flaw, but as a cry for reconnection. Many carry a void that logic can't explain, that the world can't see. And it's precisely in this void that addiction settles, offering immediate relief, but charging a high price in silence. But what if addiction is actually a sign? A kind of soul alarm asking for attention, care, transformation? Get ready to see beyond what the eyes see, and hear what the heart has been trying to say for years. Here you'll find answers that aren't in traditional manuals. You'll understand how repressed desires, unhealed traumas, and disconnection from the sacred shape the cycle of compulsion. You'll discover that the path to recovery is actually a reunion with your own essence, and that the true antidote to addiction isn't punishment, it's awareness. Are you ready for this journey? Then come with me, because maybe what you've always called weakness is just the beginning of your most powerful awakening. There's a hole many carry in their chest, and it isn't physical, it's a silence that screams, an absence that weighs. Addiction often begins as a response to this emptiness, trying to fill what isn't understood. Alcohol, drugs, gambling, food, even overworking. All can be tools with a common goal: to numb. And the curious part is, the more you consume, the more the hole expands. Because what's missing isn't external, it's soul, it's meaning, it's connection. Many try to silence this inner scream with distractions. But addiction isn't the real problem, it's a symptom of deep, unresolved pain. A heart starving for meaning, a spirit that forgot the way home. And the body, poor thing, suffers the consequences of what the soul still doesn't know how to say. Ever seen someone who has everything but still keeps running? That's the void speaking louder. Addiction doesn't discriminate, it welcomes anyone desperately trying to find something, anything, to make life hurt less. The unconscious attempt to fill an emotional hole with chemical or repetitive stimuli is like trying to satisfy hunger with smoke. It works for a moment, and then comes back even worse. Human beings can't stand living without meaning. That's one of the most hidden and most common pains of modern life. And addiction, in this scenario, becomes a dangerous but understandable refuge. After all, it's easier to take a shot than face the mirror and admit, "I lost myself." Nietzsche said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." And here lies the secret many don't see. Emptiness isn't solved by filling, but by reconnecting. Seeking an authentic why, surrounding yourself with inspiring people, reading provoking authors, writing what you feel, meditating in silence. These are all paths. The problem isn't what's being consumed, but what's been lost inside, and that's what needs to be recovered. Behind repetitive and seemingly irrational behavior, there's something sacred at its core: the desire for transcendence. The addict doesn't just want the substance, they seek ecstasy, relief, expansion. They want to touch something beyond pain, beyond routine, beyond everyday mediocrity. When you understand this, everything changes. Addiction isn't just escape, it's a cry, often unconscious, for something higher. That's why treating addiction with only repression is like cutting the flower without tending to the root. Compulsion, although destructive, reveals a yearning for something deeper than fleeting pleasures. It's as if the soul knows there's something greater, and in the absence of direction, it seeks it in the first available stimulus. The problem is that the chosen path usually leads to more disconnection. What was a search for ascension becomes a prison. But the original desire remains there, untouched: the desire for meaning. That's why many who overcome addiction dive into spirituality, art, or social causes. The search for transcendence is inherent to the human being. Some find it in meditation, others in nature, some in service to others. But those who never learn those paths end up stumbling into shortcuts. A cigarette becomes a disguised prayer. An overdose is, deep down, a cry for freedom. Have you ever thought of that? Sometimes the addict doesn't want to die, they just don't know how to live anymore. And that internal confusion is what perpetuates the cycle. Because no one teaches you how to listen to your soul in school. Maybe what many people lack isn't control, but direction. Books like The Power of Now or Man's Search for Meaning can open portals for those wanting to reconnect with themselves. Solitary walks, silent retreats, purposeful therapy, all of this helps access that higher dimension that addiction tries to mimic. Transcendence isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. And when it isn't consciously cultivated, the unconscious finds twisted ways to seek it. Addiction is often the shadow screaming. That part of us that was denied, ignored, pushed into the dark corners of the psyche. Childhood wounds, forgotten shames, suppressed fears. And what isn't faced charges a price. It charges in the form of self-destructive behavior, uncontrollable impulses, repetitions no one understands, not even the person themselves. The addict, in this context, isn't weak, there's someone carrying deep wounds that were never treated with the necessary care. The shadow is everything we were taught to hide. The ugly feelings, the wrong thoughts, the inappropriate emotions. And when too much emotional garbage accumulates without healthy disposal, addiction shows up as an escape valve. As an unconscious way of expressing what the person couldn't verbalize. That's why addiction feels so intimate, so personal, because it intertwines with the untold story of the one who suffers. It's the soul crying for help, disguised as habit. And there's more. When society rejects pain, the individual internalizes that rejection. They start to believe that feeling too much is weakness, that suffering is a sign of failure. And then addiction appears as a silent companion. At least here, I don't have to pretend. This happens a lot with those who grew up in cold environments, where vulnerability was punished or ignored. The bottle or the food compulsion becomes emotional shelter. An attempt to embrace what was never embraced. Working with the shadow takes courage. It's like cleaning out a basement full of forgotten memories. But it's in this process that addiction begins to lose its power. Therapies like Jungian analysis, support groups, therapeutic writing, all of this helps give voice to what was silenced. Because when the unconscious is illuminated, it stops running the show from behind the curtain. Addiction might be a monster. But sometimes all it wants is to be heard. From an early age, many learn to wear masks. Masks of strength, success, perfection. But behind these layers there's a self that cries out for authenticity. Addiction enters the scene when the true self becomes unbearable to live, or worse, invisible. The person no longer recognizes themselves and seeks, in compulsive repetition, an escape from the inner mirror. It's no wonder so many addicts say, "I don't know who I am anymore." This false self is built to please, to survive, to avoid rejection. But it comes at a high cost, disconnection from one's own essence. And addiction emerges as a refuge from the weight of this forced role. When the real identity is suffocated, the body and mind cry out for an escape valve. It's as if addiction says, "Let me be you for a while since you can't." It's sad but deeply human. The escape from true identity can also manifest in subtle addictions, like overproductivity, social media, or even performative spirituality. Anything that serves to avoid internal silence can become a prison. And as paradoxical as it may seem, reconnecting with who you are takes courage to dismantle everything built just to survive. It's not about creating a new self, but about remembering who you were before the world told you who you should be. Want to reconnect with your essence? Try writing every day without a filter, as if no one will read it. Practice intentional silence without distractions. Talk to people you admire not for what they have, but for who they are. Authenticity may hurt at first, but it sets you free. Addiction disconnects you, but truth integrates you. And in the end, no one heals trying to be someone else. Healing begins when you have the courage to be who you've always been. It's much easier to point outward than to dive inward. Internal pain is too heavy, and the mind, in a self-protective instinct, builds narratives that shift responsibility. It was my childhood, it was my boss, it was life that hurt me. And it's not exactly wrong, but it's not the whole story either. Projection is the emotional shield of someone who hasn't yet had the strength to look in the mirror honestly. In this scenario, addiction becomes the cloth that covers the mirror's crack. Denying your own suffering is a way to try to stay in control. Admitting the pain would mean acknowledging that something needs to change, and change requires energy, courage, and willingness to face what hurts. That's why the addict often prefers to blame the world, the partner, the government, bad luck. Everything seems more guilty than one's own unresolved traumas. And that's how suffering gets prolonged, avoiding the root and only trimming the leaves. But there comes a point when the world can no longer be blamed. The repetition of suffering wears you down, exhausts you, breaks your defenses. And then the possibility of something new appears. Responsibility. Not destructive guilt, but the awareness that yes, something needs to be faced. Denial loses strength when the pain becomes unbearable. And that, though it may seem like rock bottom, is often the beginning of the climb. Because without truth, there is no liberation. Want to start getting out of denial? Ask real questions. What am I avoiding feeling? What part of my story am I still stuck in? Right? Find a therapist, join conversation circles. The healing process requires brutal honesty, but also offers a peace that can't be bought. Blaming the world is easy, but truly living is an act of courage. And that courage, believe it or not, is already within you, just waiting to be awakened. Addiction is a bitter dance between desire and guilt. First comes the impulse, that urgent craving that promises relief. Then the act. And soon after, the inner punishment, shame, self-condemnation, self-hatred. The cycle closes like a perfect trap, where each step reinforces the next. What starts as pleasure ends in pain, and that pain becomes the trigger to seek pleasure again. It's an eternal return, just without the poetry. In this cycle, desire is not the true villain. The problem is the emptiness that feeds it and the guilt that follows. The addict's mind gets used to this motion like a maze where every exit leads back to the same place. Guilt, instead of leading to change, becomes fuel for self-destruction. Since I messed up again, screw it. That's the silent phrase many carry inside without even realizing. Toxic self-criticism doesn't help anyone get better. On the contrary, it drags you down. And the cruelest part is that many addicts don't feel worthy of freedom. Deep down, they believe they deserve the suffering. And that keeps the cycle alive. To break this mechanism, self-compassion must be cultivated. Not as an excuse but as a foundation for a fresh start. No one heals by hating themselves. Healing requires tenderness. A good way to begin this shift is by writing letters to yourself without judgment, with sincerity. Practice forgiveness, not just of others but of yourself. Seek support in sharing groups where mistakes aren't sins but starting points. And always remember, the cycle of addiction isn't a sign of weakness, but of unhealed pain. Breaking that pattern doesn't happen in a snap. But it starts the moment guilt is replaced by responsibility with affection. Carl Jung said addiction is actually a misdirected spiritual search. And when you understand that, everything changes perspective. It's not just about stopping the use of something, but about finding something greater to live for. In this context, spiritual awakening isn't religion, it's reconnection with your own essence. It's when the soul finally finds a place to rest. And only from there does addiction truly begin to lose its hold. This transformation doesn't happen with ready-made dogmas or magic formulas. Spiritual awakening is like waking from a long dream, where you thought the solution was outside, and you realize it was always within. It's a silent but powerful shift. Many who overcome addiction report feeling a new peace, a new vision of the world. And it's no coincidence, it's the effect of touching something sacred within yourself. Spirituality, when lived in a practical and honest way, brings a new kind of fulfillment. It's not escape, it's presence. It can be found in a deep conversation, a sincere prayer, or the silence of the early morning while looking at the sky. It's not about becoming someone enlightened, but remembering that you already are light, even if covered by pain and addictions. Awakening is not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new one. And anyone who has felt this touch of the sacred knows. No addiction can sustain itself when the soul finally finds a home. Because when you are full of purpose, there's no more room to fill with illusion. We live in a noisy, fast-paced world full of distractions, but empty of meaning. And this disconnection from the sacred, from something that transcends the immediate, is fertile ground for addiction to flourish. When the soul doesn't find nourishment in deep experiences, it looks for substitutes in quick pleasures. The problem is, nothing superficial can meet the need for transcendence. It's like trying to quench thirst with salt water. Spirituality, which once was a guide, has become almost a taboo. We talk a lot about productivity, little about purpose. A lot about success, almost nothing about inner silence. And when the sacred fades inside a person, they become an easy target for emptiness. The absence of something greater leaves an emotional hole where addiction comfortably settles. It's like losing the soul's GPS and trying to navigate using shortcuts that only lead in circles. Many don't even realize they are disconnected. They think life is just this: wake up, work, consume, repeat. But deep down something feels off. A subtle void, a sadness without a name. That's where addiction comes in as the solution. But in truth, it's just another layer of disconnection. That's why reconnecting with the sacred, in whatever way, is one of the most important keys on the path to recovery. It can be meditating 10 minutes a day, walking barefoot on the earth, or even exchanging messages with someone who makes you feel alive. It can be studying philosophy, taking part in symbolic rituals, watching the sunset without rush. The sacred lives in these details. Reconnecting with it is not a spiritual luxury, it's an existential urgency. Because without that invisible thread connecting the heart to the universe, life becomes mere survival and addiction, inevitable. Recovering from an addiction is more than quitting a habit, it's rediscovering yourself. The individuation journey, as Jung said, is the process of becoming who you are, uniting the broken, forgotten, denied parts. And addiction, as devastating as it is, can be the beginning of that walk. When a person starts to heal, they're not just stopping something, they're rebuilding themselves. Piece by piece, story by story, pain by pain. Integrating the shadow doesn't mean getting rid of it, but embracing it. It's understanding that we are made of light and darkness, and denying half of yourself is living only halfway. The recovering addict discovers they can look at their pain without being ruled by it. They begin to listen to their story with compassion, to give meaning to the chaos they've lived. And it's in that radical acceptance that true strength is born. Healing is not linear, but it is deeply transformative. The process is like putting together the pieces of a puzzle that, for years, were scattered on the floor. Each piece that fits brings a sense of relief and belonging. What was once only matter how many times you've fallen, what matters is how many times you've chosen to keep going. Turning addiction into a journey of self-knowledge isn't cheap poetry. It's reality for those who choose to take responsibility for their own story. Inspiring reads, like biographies of people who overcame great struggles, movies like Coach Carter or The Pursuit of Happiness, help remind us that starting over is possible. Addiction is not the end, it might actually be the truest beginning someone has ever lived. Transformation begins with one step, the step of listening. In the end, addiction is not the villain, it's the messenger. The pain it brings points to an absence, a forgetting of self, a disconnection from the soul. But now, with everything you've heard, the question that remains is, what will you do with this new perspective? Will you keep judging the addiction? Or start listening to what it's trying to say? Because the truth is simple, though intense. No one gets lost from themselves for nothing. But everyone deserves to find their way back. Every addiction is a story waiting to be told with more truth. A pain wanting to become strength. A path that, no matter how winding, can lead back home, the inner home where peace lives. And if you've made it this far, it's because a part of you is already awakening. Don't ignore that. Use this impulse. Reflect, share, seek help, talk to someone. Transformation is possible. And more than that, it's urgent. If you felt these words spoke to you in some way, don't keep them to yourself. Spread this message, help build a more human view of addiction. Because the more light we shed on what hurts, the less room there is for darkness. And remember, addiction may have been the starting point, but it will never be your final destination. Sometimes falling is just the first step for someone who's about to fly. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell, that way you'll keep receiving content like this, that goes straight to the point. And straight to the heart.